I'm Dr. John Kruse, and today I'm going to be talking about Trump Derangement Syndrome. That is not a real condition. So as usual, I'll start with the take-home message. Take-home message is recently, we're in March of 2025, Minnesota lawmakers proposed a state law incorporating TDS, Trump Derangement Syndrome, into their laws of that state. But this is not a condition that's formally recognized by any mental health organization. It's not likely to be recognized or dignified by any mental health organization or diagnostic body within Trump's lifetime. And given that its purpose is to create stigma and stifle conversation, it doesn't merit inclusion as a real condition. In March of 2025, 5 Republican male state senators in Minnesota proposed an addition to the laws of the state, and I will quote what their law says. TDS, Trump Derangement Syndrome, is the acute onset of paranoia in otherwise normal persons that is in reaction to the policies and presidencies of President Donald J. Trump. Symptoms may include Trump-induced general hysteria, which produces an inability to distinguish between legitimate policy differences and signs of psychic pathology in President Donald J. Trump's behavior. This may be expressed by 1. Verbal expressions of intense hostility towards President Donald J. Trump, and 2. Overt acts of aggression and violence against anyone supporting President Donald J. Trump or anything that symbolizes President Donald J. Trump. So it's important to acknowledge that Trump does elicit strong feelings. He does elicit strong actions, both on his behalf and against him. And as a disclaimer, I have been accused of Trump Derangement Syndrome, and I am sure this very video may trigger more of such accusations. But how do we actually make psychiatric diagnoses? How do we decide what gets into that diagnostic list of possibilities? So in the US, we have the American Psychiatric Association since 1952 has been publishing a diagnostic and statistical manual of mental disorders, shortly abbreviated as DSM. Right now we are on DSM-5-TR for the text revision of the 5th edition. There's actually been 8 published manuals about a decade apart, so over 70 years we have 8 editions, so it takes a long time to revise and update each one. The DSM is the standard worldwide. There is some competition and overlap with the World Health Organization's ICD, International Classification of Diseases, Mental Health section. There's a lot of agreement between the two. There are some on mostly minor points, differences, and sometimes one is slightly ahead of the other in terms of recognizing it. DSM is often accused of being a Bible. It's not a Bible or intended as such. The Bible is a decree from above declaring this is the way things are. It is fixed in stone. The DSM is explicitly a flexible document that will change with time as we learn more. And the better analogy than a Bible is that it's an atlas. It's a map of the terrain of mental health. That's how we are sorting things out now. It's, again, open to revision. As we learn more about what that territory looks like, we can change it. I would agree with people who think the DSM needs some major revisions. So for a new condition to be entered into DSM, the APA appoints a working committee of experts in the field, and their job is to evaluate what's already been published in research, and they often publish their own meta-analyses and reviews. An important part, people often wonder what's the S doing in the DSM? What's a statistical manual? And that is the attempt to use the tools of science to demonstrate whether something belongs in this collection of diagnoses. Once the working committee thinks that a particular condition is worthy of inclusion, there are separate independent committees that review that proposal, also explicitly solicit outside input and proposals, counter-proposals. This is a long, involved process. It doesn't require absolute unanimity, but it does require substantial consensus before any condition gets entered into the DSM. And it takes a long time. So something like internet gaming disorder, where there are dozens of studies that characterize the epidemiology, the characteristics of who tends to display this condition, the brain activation patterns of those who have it and how they differ than people who don't have it, the treatments that are available and how well they work, even though, again, a multitude of studies document that it's been more than a decade since internet gaming disorder was proposed. It still is not an established part of the DSM. And Trump derangement syndrome would take so long to be, given that there are no studies validating it at this point in time, it's not even conceivable that it would be entered into the DSM within Trump's lifetime. So two of the factors that the psychiatrists, psychologists, other mental health experts try to verify is whether a proposed condition is valid and whether it's reliable. Valid refers to, does this represent something in the real world? Does it really accurately identify a group of patients, individuals who have something substantial in common that is impairing them in the everyday world of their society? So that's validity. Does it represent something? And reliability is whether the criteria that have been used to identify that condition are consistent in identifying the same individuals over time. Because if you have criteria that are so loose that they don't identify the same people, or they're so rigid that they don't incorporate some amount of change when the individual might still have the condition, they're not going to be useful criteria. And it is worth pointing out that our diagnostic system is embedded in a cultural milieu, that there is a cultural component, that we are not just assessing brains and neurochemicals and circuitries and activation, that behavior, that thoughts, that feelings are always displayed in a cultural environment. And a lot of this is dependent on what the culture finds as aberrant or different or wrong. And cultures, as well as individuals, can change over time. So that begs the question of, why do we make psychiatric diagnoses at all? Aren't these just bad stigmatizing labels? And the answer is threefold. We come up with psychiatric diagnoses to understand what's going on, to predict what's going to happen in the future, to target treatment to help that condition. So the understanding is there for both the individual person who is suffering, often knowing, oh, this is something that other people have, that other people have gotten through, that other people have found effective treatments for. It often becomes an important piece of a person's identity. It's also important for the treatment team to understand, why are we seeing this behavior? Why does this person do this? How can we help them is shaped on our understanding of what's going on. In terms of prediction, the predictions are general and broad-based. We're not being able to predict, is this person going to log onto the internet at 12:14, 7 days from now, and type in this message? It's not that level of prediction. It's, are episodes more likely to get better or worse? If we don't intervene, what's likely to happen? What other conditions is this person more likely than the general population to have, given that they have this condition? So all of that's useful information for individual lives and families and friends. And then the third reason to diagnose a psychiatric condition is to provide targeted treatment. So if you have an incorrect diagnosis, if you think you're treating someone's anxiety disorder and you give them a sedating benzodiazepine and things get worse, it may be that they really had ADHD and that's why they were scattered and off track and not remembering information well and blurting things out and interrupting others. It might not have been anxiety at all. So without accurate diagnoses, we are often at risk of applying treatments that are not helpful, but may be counterproductive or harmful. So uniting all of these is that the reason to make psychiatric diagnoses is to alleviate suffering. And that doesn't mean we always do a perfect job of it. That doesn't mean psychiatric practices and criteria haven't been abused over time. And particularly, there's two different types of scenarios. One is intentional misuse. So regimes like the Soviet Union, sending people to the Gulag, sending them to Siberia to break up rocks or freeze in the cold. Psychiatric diagnoses were used to justify singling out dissidents for their behavior. Similarly happening right now in Chinese re-education camps, where people are given psychiatric diagnoses to enforce the will of the state to repress opposition to it. There's another way psychiatric labels have been unintentionally harmful or biasing, and that's when they align with social biases that just reflect social biases, but not necessarily the truth. And one of the best examples of that is, for the first 20 years of the DSM, homosexuality was listed as a psychiatric disorder or disease. It was removed close to 50 years ago now. And a lot of what was construed or misconstrued as an illness or a problem was one higher association with depression, with substance abuse, with suicide, and rates of all those conditions, co-occurring conditions, have decreased in the years since we have removed homosexuality from the diagnostic psychiatric manuals, but also decreased and eliminated criminalization of such behaviors. So it doesn't seem that there's anything automatically impairing the functions or social connections of people who are gay, lesbian, or somewhere on the LGBT spectrum. But for years, psychiatry was working along the biases of society. So one question is, given at this current moment, there are many powerful individuals and organizations, far more powerful than the American Psychiatric Association, that have already been coerced by the Trump administration to disavow their previous stances on equity, on racism, support for LGBTQ trans individuals. So could the APA, it's a far weaker organization than many that have already bowed down to Trump. So I'd say it's certainly possible. Stranger things have already happened in this day and time, but I think what's important to recognize, the people who have bowed down have been focused mostly on their power, not on their principles. And they see their road to future power or riches in an ongoing way as consistent with bowing down. I think the members of the APA, and particularly those who are involved in the DSM and the committees that revise and work on that, are far more interested in principles and maintaining their principles than yielding some small amount of power. So I don't see it changing. I may be naive. Getting back to psychiatric diagnoses are about understanding, about prediction, and about treatment. And there's nothing about Trump Derangement Syndrome that seems particularly focused or interested in understanding individuals, or about predicting future behavior, or about helping them with treatment. So that's a compelling reason it doesn't belong there. Reason number two is we already have a condition called delusional disorder, potentially a subset of this, but there doesn't seem to be any need or reason to carve out a specific, explicit exception or case example. So what is delusional disorder? Delusional disorder is having persistent false beliefs, a delusion that is not based on reality, and that has a significant impact, impairing impact on one's life and relationships. So characteristics of a delusion that are sufficient to merit a delusional disorder include a lack of insight that the belief is false, excessive emotional distress, that could be anger, it could be fear, it could be anxiety tied to those beliefs. It can include social isolation from those not sharing the belief. We're seeing lots of that in this country. It could be unusual or bizarre behavior, such as stalking someone else or violence against them based on these delusions. And again, what's important to emphasize is one can have delusional thoughts without having a delusional disorder. And I would argue most of us have some delusional thoughts. A phrase I came up with way back in school years, so way before the Trump era, way before Fox News became there, is that we learn something wrong every day. And we incorporate that into our misunderstanding of the world. Most of the time, these are minor misunderstandings. It may be we misheard something. It may be someone else repeated information that was inaccurate. Most of our delusions are mild and minor and not influencing life. Again, it's only when delusions are interfering with normal functioning that it becomes a delusional disorder. So the most common delusions are paranoia, grandiosity, jealousy, sexual delusions, erotomania. Delusions we have shape the types of delusions because of our evolutionary history, how humans evolved, but the specific content is often strongly shaped by our culture. So paranoia first, and paranoia is usually described as a state of fear, of feeling that you're being followed, you're being persecuted, you're being harassed, you're being betrayed. Paranoia comes up because humans are social animals. We evolved in groups. It was extremely dangerous, if not lethal, to be alone. You wouldn't make it on the savannah. You couldn't protect yourself against predators. You couldn't probably gather enough protein and other nutrients to stay alive. Certainly, even if you stayed alive, weren't procreating if you're all alone. So a fear of being shunned, a fear of being rejected from the herd or the group is intrinsic in our evolutionary history, and that seems to be a reason why paranoia across cultures is so prevalent. However, the content of who you think is surveilling you or harassing you or targeting you, why you think that, are tightly tied to our culture. So different fears have shown up at different times in U.S. history, at different eras, and clearly they reflect what's going on in the time in the world. Other common types of delusions include grandiosity, so believing you have special powers or abilities when it's, again, demonstrably shown that you don't have them. So repeatedly claiming that you and you alone understand tariffs or understand nuclear power or wind power or the relationship with China or how to solve the Ukraine war are clearly delusional. They've previously repeatedly been shown to be false, and to continue making claims like that is a grandiose delusion. Other common fears are jealousy, fear of being cheated on, what your partner may be doing or up to, or that others are getting credit for what you should have gotten credit for, and sexual erotomanic, that believing particularly often celebrities are in love with you. And again, both of those types of delusions are clearly tied to our evolutionary history of being social group animals, and our status within the group has been essential to staying alive. So one debate among experts in delusions and delusional disorder is, if a delusion is widespread, is it still a delusion or not? I come down on the side that if it's still false and provably false, then it is still a delusion, even if it's a widespread delusion. So, for example, in Columbus's time, most people thought the world was flat. Now, there was already plenty of evidence and intricate arguments from scientists in the Arab world, early Renaissance period, from the Greek and Roman observations. So from astronomical observations, from the interaction of objects as they approach the horizon, from how we see gravity working, particularly with pendulums swinging. We have compelling evidence from all those that the world is not flat and that it indeed is round. In Columbus's time, though, most of this information wasn't widely available. Their belief in a delusional thought, again, wasn't causing problems for most of them. So it wasn't a delusional disorder. It was just an incidental delusion. In our modern time, there's still, and this is surprising to many, but at least one recent survey found 10% of Americans believe that the earth was flat. It's not clear how representative that sample is. It's not clear exactly how they worded the question, but it's not a trivial group. And this is despite we have far more direct evidence, mostly from being aboard airplanes, provides good evidence it's not being flat. So in both cases, the same belief the earth is flat is delusional then and now, but the difference 300, 400 years ago was largely because of ignorance. Right now, you'd have to attribute it to either willful illogic or mistrust or greater fears of paranoia being lied to. And why this question is pertinent is that it's active going on in society today. So, for example, a substantial portion of the US population still believes that Trump was defrauded of victory and he truly won the 2020 election. Now, that is despite every legal charge, every claim, every accusation being extensively refuted. Courts run by Democrats or Republicans have never substantiated any of the findings. And furthermore, the major organizations that promulgated and shared this lie, many of the staff members, the owners, have publicly and under oath proclaimed that they knew it to be a lie and that they continue to tell it. And many of them have documented they themselves informed Trump that this was a lie and there was no basis in it. So this is a delusion, even though it is widespread and still pervasive in American society. Point here is that we don't need to make a special case of Trump derangement disorder because it already, to the extent it exists, is part of delusional disorder. So one question is, does Trump derangement disorder really apply to anybody? And I say, probably. There are individuals I've seen who seem to be ranting, yelling, writing in a way that they were without discretion, just objecting to anything Trump says, does, and some of them get loud, agitated, and may well have been involved in acts of violence. So maybe it fits in that sense. But most of the time I've seen the TDS label being targeted at people, it's being used not in a way that's even consistent with the way the authors have written it in this Minnesota law. So what I have seen is most of the time people who are complaining about Trump are making objections that are valid, rational observations. They may have different conclusions than everyone else does, but they are usually clearly identifying that they are upset at Trump's behavior or his patterns of behavior, or they are specifically complaining about specific policies. They're not conflating, I hate Trump, therefore I hate this policy. They are singling out and identifying what they see as inconsistent, stupid, cruel, or abusive of certain policies. Very seldom do I see people mistaking Trump's psychic pathology for valid, legitimate policy differences, as is written in this Minnesota law. And it's particularly telling that the Minnesota law doesn't say the problem is people who are confusing valid policy arguments with putative or alleged or proclaimed signs of psychic pathology. The Minnesota law, written by MAGA Republicans, actually is explicitly acknowledging that Trump does have signs of psychic pathology. It's written right there in their law. So what do we make of Trump's psychic pathology? So first of all, should we even be discussing this? Or can we make a diagnosis in the psychiatric realm from a public video? There are some people who still say we shouldn't, but one of the major teaching tools right now in teaching students, mental health students, psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers about psychiatric diagnosis uses video as a teaching tool to identify and characterize psychiatric conditions. 2, it's been extensively validated that video interviews, evaluations of individuals performs as well as in person, particularly for conditions such as ADHD. So I'm not saying 1 2-second clip can confirm a diagnosis. What I'm saying is that particularly for a public individual of Trump's stature, where we have a huge, voluminous video archive, we have many more hours of actual observations. We have them covering a longer period of history and time. We have him in more different settings and environments. We see him at more different times of day. We see him interacting with more people. We have more corroborating history from people who've interacted with him than you could possibly ever obtain in a one-on-one in-person evaluation. Furthermore, the strength and value of the video record is that we can do objective analyses of body movements, of head movements, of eye movements, of patterns of speech, of content of the speech, but also looking at the timing, the timbre, the quality of the speech. And those are increasingly being used for refining and clarifying psychiatric diagnoses. The one thing we lack is that we don't have the ability to ask direct questions of him or any other one person being evaluated this way. But we know that many people, either through not fully conscious reasons, either deny, diminish, or hide symptoms from an evaluator, and also that some people consciously, overtly do lie, manipulate, or hide things from an evaluator. So it's not clear what people think would be gained by directly questioning Trump about his mental health conditions. And he meets clearly criteria for 2 different conditions and probably a third. So with ADHD, I've written a book about this. I won't go into extensive detail. ADHD symptoms are defined in terms of observable behaviors, that he interrupts others, walks around when others are seated, is fidgeting, is making mistakes from inattention to details, is easily distracted. He displays these in excess for his age, for his cultural background, and they interfere with his ability to perform. He unquestionably meets the criteria for ADHD. He also unquestionably meets the criteria for narcissistic personality disorder. He explicitly has repeatedly told us of his grandiose ideas about himself, repeatedly devalued others and showed a lack of empathy. Whether or not he fulfills criteria for dementia, there's fairly compelling evidence that the decrements in his ability to use language, to have one sentence follow another intelligibly, shrinkage of his vocabulary over the last decade has been considerably in excess of what we would attribute to normal aging. And in a democracy, we should be able to discuss what is going on among our public leaders, and even professionals should be able to do that. Jumping back to Minnesota, another reason this is not likely to become a law is that the Democrats had a very narrow majority in the Minnesota Senate, but their majority actually has grown by 1 since this proposed law was proposed, and one of the 5 sponsors resigned after soliciting sex from an undercover, displaying themselves as an underage woman. And the reason for bringing up this resignation is not to shame the individual, because this is an individual who needs mental health treatment themselves, and we should be encouraging his seeking help, not discouraging it, as his own behaviors have been discouraging, but to show that there is a parallel between, in both situations, this proposed law and his seeking sex from a minor who he knew was a minor. He was exploiting his power for his own personal satisfaction with disregard for the voice of another individual who is in a position of less power. So it's unlikely this law will ever get passed in Minnesota, but it's fairly likely that in another state it may be rammed through, because there's been a very consistent pattern of, whether it's about abortion rights, transgender laws, others, of one fake grassroots movement repeating MAGA operating procedures from one state to another and getting restrictive laws passed that infringe on people's rights. So we are likely to see a Trump Derangement Syndrome diagnosis being recognized by some state in the future to be. So the last part of the argument against this Trump Derangement Syndrome is looking at how it's used. When it is used by its proponents, it's invariably being used when they cannot rebut the content of the arguments, when they cannot find a legitimate argument against either the policy decisions Trump has made, or that they can't rebut the body of evidence that he has behavioral patterns completely consistent with ADHD or with narcissistic personality disorder. It is used explicitly as a tool to discredit the speaker. This tool, Trump himself has used to label and explicitly to discredit, and he has, in the short term, a fairly successful track record of silencing people, discrediting people. The problem is, when you shoot the messenger, that doesn't change the message, and the message here is true. So in the short term, you may succeed in trying to silence someone, but it's not a clever long-term strategy. So whether we're talking policy or USAID, the IRS, the CDC, the FAA, the Defense Department, these are all designed by humans, they're all staffed by humans. None of them are perfect. But in a democracy, we should be able to discuss what we want to do to improve or even to curtail these governmental agencies. But wholesale destruction of them without even, quote, a concept of a plan is both irrational and irresponsible. And calling it out for being irresponsible and irrational is neither irrational nor irresponsible. It's actually our duties in a democracy. Trump also clearly has mental health issues. It is appropriate in a democracy we can discuss those. He has clearly proposed policies that will harm many, many individuals, and this should be open to conversation. So I don't think just because words emanate from Trump's mouth that they should be automatically discounted. I think eliminating the penny makes sense. But just because Trump is one of the 8 billion imperfect people on this planet, he's no different than others. He holds more power, but he makes mistakes. We should be able to acknowledge that. However, I do think we should discontinue using the term Trump derangement syndrome because it's intended to be derogatory and to stifle, rather encourage discussion. And the users of the term don't even employ it in accordance with how they have defined it. So rather than giving TDS more field to roam in, Trump derangement syndrome should be retired to some home on derange where the deer and the antelope play.